Wings. Humans have been obsessed with wings for, well, I don't know how long actually. Angels are most commonly depicted as having the form of humans but with wings. Dragons, basically a big lizard but with wings, most of them at least. Pegasus, horse with wings. Periton, stag with wings. Buffalo wings, well, that has nothing to do with the animal, it's a city name. Anyway, there is also the famous tale of Icarus flying too close to the sun, where Daedalus constructed wings made out of bird feathers and beeswax for both of them. People have been so used to wings that a lot of us might not even know the answer to this simple question, which I'll bring up right away. What exactly is wing? Traditionally speaking, wing or wanger as a term is used for birds' forelimbs. Later on, it's also used for insect wings, bat wings, and pterosaur wings as we now know it. It might be obvious, but let me just clearly state it to make it absolutely obvious. The word is used for those structures because those structures are used for flying. But now, the question is, what exactly is flying? What is the distinction between flying and gliding? And what about soaring? Well, the answer can be quite simple actually, if we're talking about animal at least. For flying, two things are involved, which are lift and thrust. So, for an animal locomotion to be considered flying, it needs upward propulsion and forward propulsion. Both of these can be achieved by beating their wings. That's the main function of wings. Oh, and keep in mind that to achieve flight, the lift force needs to be greater than their weight, while the thrust needs to be greater than the drag they experience. Now, for gliding, lift exists to some extent, but the force is not strong enough to elevate them. Basically, they are gradually losing height, but not as fast as free falling, of course. Oh, and there is no thrust involved while being airborne, but horizontal movement still exists to some extent. Why? Well, to put it very simply, that's just how the physics works. There are drags that can displace them horizontally. Most of the time, the animals also leap from a ledge, and that contributes to the horizontal displacement. There is actually another form of this locomotion called parachuting. Different authors might have different opinion, but the simplest version is, if the falling angle is greater than 45 degrees from the horizontal line, it's parachuting. If not, then it's gliding. Quite simple, right? Keep in mind though, some authors uses the term flight for both. The flying that I talked about earlier, the one that involves both lift and thrust, that one is called powered flight, while gliding and parachuting is called unpowered flight. I personally don't like to use the term powered and unpowered flight because it can be quite confusing for students when I teach in my native language. So I usually use the term aerial locomotion instead of flight. I understand that it's longer and might be tedious to say though, so using the term flight might be more comfortable for most people. Anyway, the true flight is just one form of powered aerial locomotion. I'm sure most of you have heard soaring before. When talking about animal, soaring is a powered aerial locomotion which power doesn't come from muscle. The power comes from external sources, mainly winds or thermal updrafts. So if you see an animal gaining elevation and or performing aerial locomotion without flapping their wings, that's soaring. Another form of this is ballooning, which is done by spiderlings. Instead of wings, they produce long silk which will then be carried by the wind, which in turn carries them. And yeah, now you know about aerial locomotion. So, why does this matter? Well, wings are the one that are used by animals to perform true flight, the internally powered aerial locomotion to be specific. So yeah, the patagium of Draconinae is not wings because they cannot fly. They can only glide and parachute. Same with the patagium of colugos, patagium of flying squirrels, patagium of gliders, patagial webbing of flying frogs, etc. Oh, don't think all patagium is not wings, because the ones in pterosaurs and bats are actually also patagium, but it's also wing at the same time. Oh, and of course, the fins of flying fishes are also, if it's not obvious enough, not wings. As far as we discovered, there are only 4 groups of animals that have wings, which I mentioned earlier, and it'll most likely be used as the thumbnail of this video. But actually, you could probably argue that some non-avian dinosaurs should be included as the fifth member, and I'll talk about that later. Anyway, each of those wings evolved independently, and some have very distinct mechanism, so it's best to talk about each of them in their own section. So, let's start with the most ancient wings, insect wings. As far as we know, or at least as far as I know, insect is the only invertebrates that have wings. The early insects are all wingless, but by the Pennsylvanian subperiod of Carboniferous, which is around 320 million years ago, several insects have evolved wings. We know this from the fossil record, of course. So, where did those wings come from? Traditionally, there are three major hypotheses to answer this question. The first is epicoxal hypothesis, which was suggested back in 1871, or possibly even earlier. This hypothesis is also known as abdominal gill hypothesis, which might be easier to remember. So, look at this image. Look at these structures specifically. These are called abdominal gills. These are the exits of aquatic insects' respiratory system. Hence, it's practically useless for terrestrial insects. If you look at abdominal gills, these structures have little winglets that can vibrate, each equipped with its own muscle. Because its respiratory function is basically useless for terrestrial insects, it developed locomotory function. Then it grew bigger over time, and finally became wings. That's the first hypothesis at least. The second hypothesis arrived around 5 years later, the paranodal hypothesis, also known as the tergal hypothesis. Tergal is their dorsal plate, by the way. So, in this one, wings are hypothesized to develop from paranodal lobe. Some ancient insects, including a relatively famous group of ancient flying insects called Paleodictyoptera, have these structures called paranodal lobe. Actually, this theory arose because a fossil called Lithomantis carbonarius was discovered. These are the lobes that I'm talking about. To put it very simply, these lobes grew bigger over time to help in parachuting for the sake of escaping predators. Over time, it grew big enough, developed connection to some muscles, and became wings. The third major hypothesis is called the endite-exite hypothesis, or simply pleural hypothesis. Pleural is the lateral side of insects, by the way. In this one, wings are hypothesized to evolve from endite and exite, which are protrusions on the inner and outer side of ancient arthropods' limbs. There are also some lesser known hypotheses, but let's just look at recent publications, shall we? So, do we have a definite answer for this mystery yet? I personally wouldn't say it's definite, but there are several recent discoveries that support each other. And what's the answer? Well, it's most likely both from tergal and pleural structures. Both contributes to the formation of wings. However, another interesting discovery in 2020 had shown genetic similarities between abdominal gills and wings. Well, the most recent explanation is simply the flap that evolved into wings also evolved into abdominal gills. So that means insects are primarily terrestrials and secondary aquatic. We thought it was the other way around because, well, there is a consensus that life originated from the ocean after all. And yeah, so far that is the most likely answer. If we discover something new in the future, it might change our view, but we'll see about that. Alright now, let's talk about structure and mechanism. Since insect wings are ontogenically different from vertebrates' wings, of course their structure is also different. There is no bone inside that serves as foundation, but the structure is supported by the veins. These veins are actually kinda similar to vertebrates' veins, in which their function is primarily as blood vessel. Well, in this case it's hemolymph instead of blood. There are also nerves and trachea within the veins. But not only that, the outer layer of these veins is covered with thickened and heavily sclerotized cuticle. That way, the veins serve as the foundation of the wings. The front edge of the wings, called costa, is also a vein, by the way. Costa is especially thickened compared to other veins. There can also be some hairs on the wings, and in some groups like Lepidopteran, the hairs are modified into scales instead. That's what makes Lepidopteran wings colorful. It can help in defense, regulate temperature, and some specialized ones can even act as sensory structures. Oh, by the way, just to make it obvious, insect wings don't have muscle on the actual wings. So, the question is, how do they flap their wings? Well, there are two distinct ways for that: direct and indirect flight. For those that exhibit direct flight, their flight muscles attach to the base of their wing. The base of the wing is hinged, hence, if you move it downward, the wings will flap upwards. The only insects that exhibit this type are those in the order Ephemeroptera and Odonata, mayflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. If you are familiar with insect taxonomy, you would notice that this is basically the clade Paleoptera. Meanwhile, other winged insects exhibit indirect flight. In this case, the muscles attach to the thorax. Basically, what they are moving with the muscle is the thorax, not the wings themselves. However, because the wings are extension of the thorax, moving the thorax will also move the wings. Now, you might think this is inefficient, but it's actually more efficient than direct flight, at least in many insects. Those insects use asynchronous muscle for flight. Those are muscles that can contract more than once per nerve impulse. Basically, with just a single nerve signal, the muscles can move multiple times. Hence, they can beat their wings rapidly with relative ease. Oh, and also, some insects exhibit wing coupling, where the forewings and hindwings of four-winged insects can be moved together with one movement. In butterflies, the humeral area of the hindwings is overlapped by the forewing. That way, the downward movement of the forewings will also move the hindwings. In many moths, the underside of the forewings has hook called retinaculum, where it forms coupling with a spine at the costal edge of the hindwings called frenulum. Hymenopterans such as bees have an advanced version of this, called hamuli, hook-like setae along the edge of the hindwings. Insect wings also have variations between groups. While most insects have their wings folded when resting, dragonflies cannot do this. Some other insects fold their wings on top of their back regularly, while some with slope like a roof. Some can only close their wings upward, like butterflies. Some have thickened forewings that cover the hindwings, such as members of the Orthoptera order. Meanwhile, beetles have elytra, a completely hardened forewings, while true bugs have hemelytra, where only half of the forewings are hardened. Oh, and of course, the shape of the wings could vary. The venation will definitely vary because it is an important trait for identification. Some have distinct pattern. Oh, and of course, some don't even have forewings. So yeah, insect wings have a lot of variation. So much that it is one of the first things to check when identifying an insect, especially to the species level. And yeah, we've talked about insect wing. Now, let's talk about vertebrate wings. But before that, all vertebrate wings are homologous in a way that all of these are vertebrate forelimbs. Unlike insect wings, they have bones as their foundation. And of course, muscles are attached to these bones, so their wings are also composed of muscles. All of them have humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpal, and phalanges. However, each of them is unique in their structure. There are also some differences in how they utilize their wings, and so let's talk about each of them in their own section, starting with the most ancient among them, Pterosaur. The oldest known pterosaur fossils dates back to the late Triassic, around 220 million years ago, maybe even older. Even the oldest known pterosaur already has this type of wing, or at least they have similar skeletal structure that indicates they do so. Now the question is, where do they come from? What is the origin of their wings? Well, the answer is we don't really know. There are three theories for this. One is their ancestor is an arboreal animal that lives from tree to tree, evolving patagium to help them glide, which over time became bigger and finally became a wing. The second one is quite similar, but instead of gliding from tree to tree, it's for parachuting to escape predator. The third one is quite different actually, which suggests a terrestrial ancestors that jumps to catch insects, developing patagium over time to enhance their jumping capability. So, which one is the most likely answer? We literally don't know actually, or at least I think so. The closest thing to a pterosaur ancestor that we've discovered is the lagerpathids. Even though this family had been discovered since the last century, this suggestion was just published in 2020. Still, if you look at them, you would most likely think, this doesn't look like a pterosaur at all. And honestly, you are not wrong. This is far from the pterosaur morphology. But yeah, there are some similarities which might indicate Lagopethids is the closest thing to pterosaur that we've discovered. Talking about extinct animal is not so easy because of specimen limitation, you know. But yeah, at the very least, there is a consensus related to the topic of this video, and the consensus is even the oldest pterosaur shares the same wing structures, mostly at least. The humerus has a large deltopectoral crest for the attachment of their muscle. Radius and ulna are long. The fourth digit is significantly elongated and become the attachment for their patagium. Oh, and yeah, their flight membrane is also called patagium, like I said earlier. Just to be clear, pterosaurs only have 4 digits on each forelimb, so that's their last finger. This is also commonly called the wing finger. The other 3 digits are basically just regular digits, each equipped with claws, which they use to walk and climb. While in their terrestrial gait, their metacarpals are rotated outwards, hence their wing fingers point backwards, and their wing fingers alongside their outer wings will be folded. Their flight membrane is divided into 3 parts. The first part is propatagium, which extends from the shoulder to their wrist. They have a unique bone called pteroid bone between their radius and carpal which support the propatagium. Next is brachiopatagium, which extends from the 4th digit to the side of their hind limb. The last one connects their legs, and potentially also their tail. If it does connect to their tail, then it's called uropatagium. If it's not, then it's called cruropatagium. Although these are also called patagium just like the one in bat, both are structurally different. The patagium of pterosaurs is not simply a flap of skin. They have actinofibrils, which are layered actin filaments. We don't exactly know the detailed structure of this actinofibril because, well, we could only look at trace fossils after all. No fresh tissue available. The hypothesized function is to help strengthen the patagium, give more control of flight movements, and enables compact folding when they are in their terrestrial gait. Intuitively, because they can deploy terrestrial gait, they can take off from the ground. Initially, it was hypothesized that, just like primitive birds, pterosaurs need to run a bit while flapping their wings to take off. Just like birds, pterosaur bones are hollow, which is why it was intuitive to think they would act like birds in terms of their flight, to some extent. However, the most recent consensus is that they use vaulting motion to take off on the spot. Even though their bones are hollow just like birds, they are still relatively stronger compared to birds' bones. Hence, pterosaur bones should be able to support their weight while doing this motion. Not only that, their wing muscles are also more distributed compared to birds. Their flapping power comes from muscles on their chest, back, along their forearms, and even their hands. It is noted that the mass of their wings, including the muscles responsible for their wing beat of course, contributes to over 40% of their total mass. So yeah, to put it simply, their wings are very strong. Still, again and again, I would like to remind you that we couldn't know for sure because there is no fresh specimen. More discoveries in the future could change our view on them. Oh, by the way, just like other groups of winged animals, the wings of pterosaur also vary. At the very least, if we're talking about proportion, we don't really know about the patagium itself because it is very rarely preserved. Honestly, we're already lucky to find several pterosaur fossils because the hollow bones make them relatively hard to fossilize because it's relatively fragile. Next, let's talk about the next vertebrate to develop wings: birds. The evolution of birds had been regularly talked about. Honestly, you might be randomly scrolling on Twitter, and every year there will most likely be at least one random thread that talks about it. For over a century, we were sure that Archaeopteryx is one of, if not the ancestor of birds, perhaps even the earliest bird. At the very least, the first bird wings, quote unquote. That's the meaning of their name, ancient wings. However, several older fossils were discovered later, such as Anchiornis, for example. So, is that the origin of birds? Or at least the origin of bird wings? Well, the more fossils we discover, the less we are sure about that. We discovered that Microraptor, or commonly pronounced Microraptor by English speakers, have feathers. But later on, we discovered that Microraptor did not only have feathers, but most likely wings. Not just a pair of wings actually. Two pair of wings. Four wings. Their forelimbs and hind limbs are all wings. So, are Microraptors birds? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some say yes, some say no. Okay, so surely Microraptor is not capable of powered flight, right? So it's not wing like the bird wings we know of, right? Maybe, maybe not. But did they actually perform powered flight? I'm pretty sure we won't ever know. But still, why did raptors and birds evolve wings in the first place? Well, there are no definite answer, but there are some theories. The same arboreal theories that I talk about in the pterosaur sections also applies here, by the way. But the model is Archaeopteryx gliding from tree to tree. Another theory based on Archaeopteryx was the cursorial model, where Archaeopteryx is thought to be runners that perform series of short jumps. The wings provided lift to extend the jump distance. Over time, it provides thrust. This theory was improved or at least modified later on by stating that the wing is useful to jump higher for hunting insects. Another version of this theory, which is strongly supported by recent publication, is the wing-assisted incline running theory, aka WAIR. It is strongly supported because it can be observed in living modern birds. So basically, when traversing steep terrain, some birds will flap their wings while running to provide lift and thrust, therefore providing ease of traversing greater inclines. And then there are also some scientists that say, hey, why do these have to be mutually exclusive? What if it's everything? And yeah, what if it's everything? But as always, we don't really know the answer because we cannot exactly observe ancient birds and bird-like theropods. Anyway, let's talk about the one that we can observe, the wings of modern birds. Like any other vertebrate wings, it is a modification of their forelimbs. Hence, they have the same bone types. In bird wings, those are humerus, radius, and ulna, and a mostly fused carpal and metacarpal called carpometacarpus. They only have 3 digits instead of the 4 that pterosaurs have. None of their digits are exceptionally long, at least not to the extent of pterosaurs' 4th digits. Unlike the pterosaurs, which wings are mostly composed of membrane, feathers contribute to most of the bird wings. Featherless wings are very slender. I mean, most of you eat that thing at least once a month, so I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with its shape. The majority of their flight muscles' volumes are located on the chest. In fact, all of the muscles that they use to beat their wings are located on their chest, attached to a structure called carina sterni, the high ridge on their breastbone. Also a structure which should be familiar for you, by the way, at least if you like to eat chicken. Anyway, getting back to feathers, the flight feathers of flying birds are very iconic. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the one that took shape in your mind when thinking about feather. Flight feathers on the wings are called remiges, or ramex for singular, while the one on their tail are called rectrices, or rectrix for singular. These are long and stiff, and these help in generating lift and thrust. Basically, the same function as the membrane in pterosaur and bat wings. In some birds, flight feathers have unique adaptation. For example, in owls, the flight feathers are serrated, which enables them to fly silently. Remiges are divided into 2 sections, depends on where the feathers attach. The ones that attach to the carpometacarpus and phalanges are called primary remiges. The ones that attach to the ulna is called secondary remiges. Some will include tertials or humerals with these and call them tertiary remiges, but those are not true remiges because those are not true flight feathers. The main function of tertials is to cover the remiges when the wings are folded. Still, remiges and tertials are not the only feathers on wings, by the way. There are smaller feathers covering the base part of the remiges and the muscular section of the wings, which are called coverts, or scientifically called tectrices. As with remiges, coverts are also divided into primaries and secondaries, depends on where they attach. The secondary coverts usually have regions with different sizes, hence it's sometimes further divided into greater, median, and lesser. Oh, by the way, the first digit of bird wings is movable, and some flight feathers are attached to this region. This region is called alveola. Birds can move this part to control the aerodynamic of their wings. It basically has the same function as a plant slat. And so, if you look at this sketch of bird wings, the feathers from 1 to 8 are primary remiges, greater primary coverts, alula, secondary remiges, greater secondary coverts, median secondary coverts, lesser secondary coverts, and tertials. Number 9 is scapulars, by the way, which are feathers that cover their scapular region. Same with insect wings and pterosaur wings, bird wings also have variations. For bird wings, there are 4 major types of wings. Those are elliptical wings, high-speed wings, low aspect ratio slotted wings, and high aspect ratio pointed wings. Oh, by the way, aspect ratio in wings reverts to the ratio of wingspan to the mean of its chord. Basically, high aspect ratio wings are long and slender ones. So, let's talk about each of these types. Elliptical wings are the one you mostly see in your daily life. Those birds that live in confined spaces, such as forests, jungles, and urbans. This type of wings provided maneuverability and the ease of taking off. These are agile and relatively small birds. Next is the high-speed wing. They have pointed wings which enables high-speed flight. They can also beat their wings rapidly to increase speed, albeit using a lot of energy. The most famous example of birds with this type of wings are swifts and falcons. Another example which might not be obvious is auk. They can fly rapidly, but underwater. You decide for yourself whether that counts as flying, but at least in terms of structures and functionality, their wings can be classified as high-speed wing. Next is the low aspect ratio slotted wings. The deep slots reduce wingtip vortices and enables them to soar and glide more efficiently. This enables them to take advantage of thermal updrafts for soaring. The low aspect ratio enables easier takeoff. Birds with this type of wings are usually big inland birds, such as eagles, storks, pelicans, vultures, etc. And the last one is the high aspect ratio wings. The high aspect ratio enables prolonged flight, albeit relatively slow. However, this also hinders in takeoff because, well, it's too big basically. Birds that have this type of wings are mostly seabirds, like albatross and frigate birds. In fact, I talked about it in my frigate bird video, so check that out if you're interested. Oh, by the way, some birds have reduced wings and are flightless, hence they don't belong to these 4 types. Those are the ratites and penguins. For penguins, some still argue that they have high-speed wings and they basically fly underwater, while some simply categorize their forelimbs as flippers. For ratites, it's definitely still wings. Ratites have reduced forelimb bones and significantly reduced carina sterni. That's why they are not strong enough to fly. Anyway, let's move on to the last group. Bat. Bats are the latest animals to evolve wings. They showed up during early Eocene, around 55 to 52 million years ago. And, unfortunately, just like pterosaurs, they seem to appear out of nowhere, simply because we don't have enough fossil evidence. This time though, it's not because their bones are hollow. Bats' bones are not hollow. However, to reduce weight so that they can fly, their bones are very slender. Hence, same with hollow bones, they are brittle. That means it's difficult to be preserved and fossilized. Hence, barely any fossil records available. The hypothesis for why bats evolve wings is basically the arboreal gliding theory that I've talked about in the Pterosaur Wing section. But this time, it's quite a strong hypothesis because such mammals exist, colugos and gliders. But still, we couldn't be sure until we find some compelling evidence in the future, if any that is. So, bat wings. Same with pterosaurs, it mostly consists of membrane. However, there are various differences between them. Pterosaurs' forelimbs only have 4 digits, with only the 4th digit elongated. Meanwhile, bat forelimbs have 5 digits, and 4 of those digits are elongated to support the patagium. You could even argue all of their digits support the wings, because while the thumb points forwards and seems to stick out of the wing structure, it still supports the leading edge of the wing. The distributed support from the 4 elongated digits enable the wing membrane to function even without actinofibril and being as thick as the pterosaur's patagium. Unlike birds, their flight muscles are distributed both on their back and chest. The one used for upstroke are on their back, while the one for downstroke are on their chest. Bats' forelimb joints are also very flexible. They have very good maneuverability and flight control. They can even hover to some extent. Oh, by the way, their wing patagium extends to the side of their hind limbs. The one between their digits are called chiropatagium or dactylopatagium. The one stretching between their fifth digit and their hind limb is called plagiopatagium, while the one stretching between their shoulder and wrist is called propatagium. They also have patagium connecting the inner side of their hind limbs and their tail, called uropatagium. If you take a closer look at their patagium, you can see veins. Not only that though, they have tiny bumps with tiny hairs on their patagium. These are used to detect airflow, enabling them to adjust speed if needed. Because it's quite thin, bats' patagium are quite fragile. They can be damaged easily, but they can heal and regrow, so it's usually not life-threatening. While there are no fancy structures for the wings of some specific bats, bats' wings still vary at least in terms of aspect ratio. Some are long and narrow, while some are short and wide. When roosting, bats will fold their wings. This is a commonly known fact for sure, but the less commonly known fact is some bats do exhibit terrestrial locomotion, and they also fold their wings while doing so. Famous example would be the common vampire bat. While doing so, they walk with their forelimbs instead of their hind limbs because their hind limbs are pretty short and relatively weak. They can also take off from ground by leaping with their forelimb and then spreading and flapping their wings. Somewhat similar to pterosaurs in this regard actually, only to some extent of course, because instead of using their hind limbs, bats flap their uropatagium to produce thrust during takeoff. And yeah, that is wing. Definitely an important trait for locomotion, not only to traverse and cover wider area, but also enabling them to fill some niche with lower competition. Keep in mind that wings are not the sole reason for their capability to fly. They need various adaptations to reduce their weight, improve their sense during flight, and also specialized respiratory system to support the increase in energy cost. That's why just making a makeshift wings won't be enough for a human to fly. But who knows? Maybe some kind of exoskeleton in the future? Not sure how much energy that thing would need to be functional though. But we'll see what'll happen in the future. I myself would rather see some more fossil discoveries to answer the mysteries surrounding their evolution. But for now, let's just learn what is known. And that's all for now.